Welcome back, folks. Today we're going to be making a guide for all of the cantrips in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, or at least part 1 of a guide going over all of the cantrips. I'm Frizz, and we're going to be going over about half of those cantrips today. Cantrips are the foundation of every spellcaster in 2e, and they're so much better than they've been in previous systems. With how they automatically scale and heighten as you level up, they can be useful throughout your entire time playing, and they'll never be a bad option. Gone are the days of every single wizard taking a crossbow with them when they go adventuring for whenever they run out of spells, because now you can just use magic to deal damage, which is really nice. Due to how good they are, it's pretty important that you pick useful cantrips that fit your character concept. So let's jump right into things, and let's talk about what cantrips are good, what cantrips are a bit meh. Let's start with Acid Splash, because it's the first alphabetically. That's how I'm doing this. Acid Splash is the only attack cantrip that deals acid damage, so if that's a thing that you're going for, then it can be a very useful spell to have. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't scale particularly well as you level up. You make a spell attack roll against someone within 30 feet, and if you hit, you will deal 1d6 acid damage and 1 splash damage to everyone within 5 feet of the target. Also, if you critically hit, then the target takes 1 persistent acid damage. This damage is alright, but it gets a lot more meh as it gets heightened. Once it gets heightened to 3rd level, then you add your spell attack modifier to the damage roll, and the persistent damage increases to 2 on a critical hit. At level 5 and every 2 levels after that, the damage increases by 1d6, and both the splash damage and persistent damage increases by 1. This damage is going to be below average for damaging cantrips, and it gets more and more behind the higher level you get. A lot of different cantrips increase their dice every single level that they get heightened, while Acid Splash, you have to wait until it gets heightened to level 5 to be dealing 2d6, which is a lot lower considering that other cantrips are doing 5d4 or 5d6 at that level. You will also have to deal with dealing splash damage to your allies, which is never going to be all that fun to handle. Regardless, you can make some good use out of Acid Splash, and it can really mess up some swarms. But it has some downsides that you're going to have to handle. While the Acid Splash cantrip is pretty mechanically meh, the Approximate cantrip is mechanically absolutely useless, but it's an absolute joy as an RP tool. It allows you to name a type of object, like copper coins, and then you get an estimate of how many of those objects are in 1 cubic foot within 10 feet of you. It's rounded, so it really is just an approximation, and you can use it as specifically as you want with the objects as long as the distinguishing features are obvious. Also, since this is just a cantrip, it falls for any attempts to disguise an object, so you can't use this to, say, try and find some counterfeit coins. Obviously, this feat is basically never going to do anything useful in combat, but it is a ton of fun. Can you imagine a sorcerer who's had the ability to cast Approximate since birth, who just gives out random approximations as a party trick? That sounds like a really fun and kind of stupid character, and it just sounds like it'd be a very fun time. My only wish is that the area that you could approximate in expanded as it gets heightened, because as it is, it has no heightened effect, and I like it when cantrips have those. Bullhorn is another interesting cantrip that makes complete sense in the world of Golarion, since of course some wizard out there would make a spell that makes them louder rather than just raising their own voice. It lasts 10 minutes once you cast it, and now you can be easily heard by anyone within 500 feet, though your voice is never distractingly loud and physical barriers can still reduce the sound, so you can't shout through a wall unless you could normally do that. The only mechanical benefit is that you get a +1 status bonus on any checks to coerce or perform when sound matters and you're performing for a large crowd or in a large space. Where it gets even more stupid is once it gets heightened to level 5, people can now hear you up from 1,200 feet away, and at level 7, people can now hear you from 1 mile away. A high-level caster casting Bullhorn can be the most annoying person possible because they can just run around and yell at the top of their lungs at night in a small village and wake literally everyone up from a mile away. There are certainly going to be uses for this, but they are going to be a little bit far between, but who doesn't want to bring their own amp with them? Chill Touch is a somewhat deceptive spell, since on first reading it feels like it should require a attack roll, but it actually just takes a fortitude save from a creature that you touch. You don't actually have to roll to touch them. If they are alive, then you can channel negative energy through them, dealing 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier, negative damage. They get a basic saving throw against the spell, and if they critically fail, then they are also enfeebled 1 for 1 round. This damage is pretty good, especially since basically no creatures are going to be resistant or immune to negative damage outside of Undead. The enfeebled effect is pretty nice whenever it comes up, but that might not be all that often because creatures don't critically fail too much. A big issue that appears when you look at this is how it impacts Undead, because Undead are a very common type of enemy to fight in a campaign, but they're immune to negative damage, so this seems like it would not be useful at all against them. Thankfully, it has different effects against Undead. If they fail their fortitude save, then they are flat-footed as the spell messes up the negative energy that animates them. If they critically fail, then they're also fleeing for 1 round, as long as they also fail a will save against the same DC. This is an alright fallback option, especially if you don't have many other spells that affect Undead. As Chill Touch gets heightened, the damage against living creatures increases by 1d4 per spell level, so this is pretty good, even though it will generally not be as useful as, other cantrips or spells against Undead, but it is a nice option when you need it. Dancing Lights is an interesting spell, since it is one of the 2 light cantrips, meaning that you can use it to light up a space. We're going to be covering Light in the next video, but Light is a lot more general than Dancing Lights. Light just allows you to light up a single object, while Dancing Lights lets you make up to 4 small floating lights that are as bright as a torch within 120 feet of you. These lights all have to be within 10 feet of each other, but each time that you sustain the spell, you can move the lights up to 60 feet. The real drawback of this spell is that it needs to be sustained, which really restricts your actions in a combat, since now you have to use an action to sustain a cantrip. So if you want to cast a spell that's 2 actions, then you have to spend your last action to sustain the lights. Which, of course, that's not going to be very good. But the big draw of this spell, and to a lesser extent Light, that a lot of people seem to look over is how any spell with the Light trait can be used to counteract any spell that makes magical darkness. It's a bit hard to do that with the Light spell sometimes, since you have to actually target the magical darkness itself. And Light can only target objects, so it depends on whether or not your GM actually allows for you to target the magical darkness to, dispel it or counteract it. But Dancing Lights is pretty easy. You just make the dancing lights inside of the magical darkness, and then you can attempt to counteract. Magical darkness can be absolutely debilitating towards your party, so getting rid of it is a game changer. And who doesn't want to have some floating lights they can use to have finer control over where lights are in a area that you need some lights. Daze is the only cantrip that is going to be dealing non-lethal damage reliably, and it's also mental damage, which means that very few creatures are going to be resistant to it. Unfortunately, the damage isn't going to actually be all that great, since Daze is a low damage cantrip, but it can be useful in certain situations. At level 1, it simply does damage equal to your spellcasting modifier, and they get a basic will save. If the target critically fails, then they're also going to be stunned 1. This isn't going to be happening all too often, because critically failing is pretty rare, but if it does happen, it is absolutely huge, since stunned is an amazing condition to apply to enemies. Also, every 2 levels that Daze gets heightened, the damage increases by 1d6. Overall, it's a nice way to be able to deal non-lethal damage, even if its actual damage isn't great, but it's nice if you're just trying to finish off a creature to keep them alive. Detect Magic is one of the most important spells in the entire game, since everyone really should have it because it can help out a ton. It obviously allows you to detect magic, which is always going to be a useful skill for a spellcaster. At level 1, the only information that you get is the absence or presence of magic that you didn't already know about. So you can cast it, and if there is a magical item in the same room as you, you know that there is magic. But you don't know where. Also, illusion magic is detected a bit differently, as it is never detected unless it has a lower level than the level of your detect magic. So if your detect magic is level 2, you will not be able to detect level 2 illusion magic or higher level illusion magic. The exception is if the magic is tied to an object and the magic itself is not actually deceptive in appearance. For example, you couldn't detect a creature under a level 2 invisibility spell if you cast first level detect magic, but you would be able to tell that an invisibility potion is magical, since the illusion magic that is tied to the potion is not actually changing the appearance or any element of the potion itself. This spell gets way better as it levels up. At 3rd level, you also learn the School of Magic of the highest level effect within range. This can be really helpful for detecting traps, since getting a sudden sense of evocation magic should be setting off alarm bells in your head that a trap is coming up. Other magic types can be used to make traps, but none of them will be nearly as explosive. At 4th level, it functions the exact same as at 3rd level, but you can also tell where the highest level of magic is in the area, as if you were using like an imprecise sense or something. It's basically going to give you a 5-foot cube, but it can be larger if that magic takes up more squares, like, say, I don't know, an invisible creature with a buff spell on them that is large-sized. Then that'll take up a 10-foot cube. This can make finding magical items in a cluttered room so much easier, and it can help you find invisible creatures, since if they own any magical items, or if they have any buff spells cast on them, then you will still be able to find what square they're in despite not being able to actually detect whatever the effect is that makes them invisible. You can't detect the illusion magic, but you can still detect the transmutation magic that is giving them haste. Overall, every spellcaster should learn Detect Magic, since it is incredibly useful and it seems like the kind of spell that you'd learn in Magic 101 in college. Take a guess at what enemies the Disrupt Undead cantrip can be used on. That's right, it's Undead. You shoot a blast of positive energy at an undead creature within 30 feet of you, and then you deal 1d6 plus your spellcasting modifier in positive damage. They can reduce this effect with a basic fortitude save, but if they also critically fail, then they're enfeebled 1 for 1 round. Every single level that this gets heightened, the damage increases by 1d6. If you're a follower of a deity that hates undead, or you just think that running into them is probably going to happen, which is true in most campaigns, then this is a great cantrip to have, since positive damage can really mess up undead. It's one thing that they are almost certainly not going to have a resistance to, so you can really rip them a new one. Divine Lance is a pretty simple spell, if it is a bit situational. You shoot a beam of divine energy towards someone within 30 feet of you. You choose an alignment that your deity has, and the beam does that type of damage, so you could choose good and then deal good damage. You can't even cast the spell if you don't have a deity, or if your deity is true neutral, but this can be situationally incredibly strong. You have to hit them with your spell attack roll first, but a lot of outsiders are often weak to the opposite type of damage. So, like, demons will generally be weak to good damage. So, if you think that you're going to be fighting a lot of outsiders, then you can get a ton of use out of this feat. Every single spell level that Divine Lance gets heightened, the damage increases by 1d4, so it's never going to be bad. I'm also just going to point out here that a sort of Holy Crusader Magus with a Cleric dedication can make terrifyingly good use out of both Disrupt Undead and Divine Lance with the Arcane Cascade class feature, since then you can apply either positive damage or alignment damage onto all of your attack rolls to really make some good use out of a creature's weakness. Electric Arc is the best cantrip in the game. I'm not going to waffle around about it, it's just straight up incredible. You target 2 creatures that are both within 30 feet of you and within 30 feet of each other, and then you deal 1d4 plus your spellcasting modifier electricity damage to both of them, and they both get basic reflex saves. This damage increases by 1d4 every single level. This is insane, since no other damaging cantrip does this kind of damage against multiple targets, and even single target damaging cantrips only maybe deal 1d6 rather than 1d4, which really isn't a huge difference, so this is absolutely incredible. Honestly, it might be a little bit too good because it makes all the other cantrips kind of worse in comparison, but you really cannot go wrong by taking Electric Arc. Forbidding Ward is a fantastic cantrip. even though it does have to be sustained. You choose one ally and one enemy within range, and as long as you sustain the spell, that ally gets a +1 status bonus to their AC and saving throws against all of that enemy's attacks, spells, and other effects. This is fantastic for boss fights, since you can sit comfy at the back of a fight and give someone on your front line a boost to their survivability without having to actually get close. It's obviously going to be better for fights against single creatures, like quote-unquote boss fights, because it only is helpful against one creature at a time, so if someone on the front line is fighting like 5 people, it'll only be useful against 20% of the attack rolls that are made against them and 20% of the saves that they have to make. So ideally you want to use it on big, super dangerous creatures. Status bonuses aren't all that common, so it's likely to be able to stack with just about everything. Also, at 6th level, whenever it gets heightened to 6th level that is, not 6th character level, this is going to be like a level 11, the bonus gets even better as it increases to +2, which just makes it a substantially better spell to cast. Gale Blast is an interesting damaging cantrip that has a bit below average damage, but has some useful battlefield control abilities. You create a 5-foot emanation of whirling air, dealing bludgeoning damage to all creatures in the area equal to the spell casting modifier that you have. They get a basic reflex save to reduce the damage, though if they fail or critically fail, then they get pushed away 5 or 10 feet away from you respectively. This damage increases by 1d6 every 2 levels as it gets heightened, which, isn't actually all that good, to be honest, but the main draw is being able to push around targets, which is always going to be useful. If someone's next to a cliff, then Gale Blast can be very, very useful. Ghost Sound is a spell whose usefulness will really depend a lot on your GM. Rules as written, it's really obvious and loud whenever you cast a spell, but your GM might be lenient and allow you to hide whenever you're casting a spell using a stealth check or a different skill check of their choice. Otherwise, sorcerers are the only class that gets the ability to cast silently or even conceal whenever they're casting, which makes Ghost Sound a lot more useful. Speaking of which, let's just talk about what Ghost Sound even does. It allows you to make simple sounds that have a maximum volume of like 4 people shouting, and the sounds come from 1 square within 30 feet of you. You can't make any words or complex noises, though the range does increase to 60 feet at level 3 and 120 feet once it gets heightened to 5th level. Ghost Sound can be great for causing chaos, though its usefulness does depend a lot on how obvious casting it is. If you want to, say, use it to draw some people's attention away from you, or create a distraction, it's generally pretty important for those plans that you don't make yourself obvious whenever you are casting it in the first place. So, you don't want to draw attention to yourself, so ideally you don't want to be incredibly obvious when casting Ghost Sound. So, it's a lot up to your GM on how silent you can make casting this spell. Gouging Claw is just as good mechanically as it is slightly creepy. You morph one of your limbs temporarily into having a claw, and then make a melee spell attack against a target within your touch range's AC. You deal 1d6 plus your spellcasting modifier slashing or piercing damage if you hit, and if you critically hit, then you double the damage like normal, but you also deal 1d4 persistent bleed damage. This makes Gouging Claw into the single highest damaging cantrip whenever you're targeting single enemies, but it does have the downside of requiring you to be within melee range of the target. A lot of spellcasters are going to be pretty squishy, so being up close and personal can be pretty dangerous. This is fantastic for Magi, since they're going to be up close regardless, unless they are a shooting star magus, so they can make a ton of use out of a high damaging melee cantrip. Also, I'm just going to throw it out here that the idea of using reach metamagic on this to give you a 30-foot range on the spell is really freaky, since, that probably means that you now have a 30-foot long claw, which is a bit disturbing. Also, I forgot to mention it earlier, but the heightened effect is every single level that it gets heightened, you deal an additional 1d6 damage and 1d4 bleed damage on a crit, which is absolutely fantastic. Guidance is absolutely fantastic for multiple reasons. First, it only costs a single action. Hardly any spells can only be cast with one action, and since it's a verbal-only spell, it also means it doesn't provoke any attacks of opportunity, so it's great for characters that will be in the front a lot. The second reason why Guidance is so good is just how useful its effect is. You choose a target within 30 feet, and then they get a +1 status bonus on one attack roll, perception check, saving throw, or skill check of their choice before the start of your next turn. Once they have had Guidance cast on them, they can't benefit from it for an hour, so they're temporarily immune. Giving a bonus like that as a single action is great, and while it won't last for all too long, it's great for just basic utility. Generally, every single character will make one of those checks before the start of your next turn, and because they can pick and choose which bonus they want it for, you can't mess up by giving them a bonus on a roll that they don't end up making, because they will end up making one of those checks. It's also really useful out of combat, since you can give someone some guidance to help them, say on like an athletics check to climb a wall, or basically anything that involves rolling a dice. Basically, Guidance is just an absolutely killer spell. Guidance is absolutely fantastic for multiple reasons. First, it only costs a single action. Hardly any spells can only be cast with one action, and since it's a verbal-only spell, it also means it doesn't provoke any attacks of opportunity, so it's great for characters that will be in the front a lot. The second reason why Guidance is so good is just how useful its effect is. You choose a target within 30 feet, and then they get a +1 status bonus on one attack roll, perception check, saving throw, or skill check of their choice before the start of your next turn. Once they have had Guidance cast on them, they can't benefit from it for an hour, so they're temporarily immune. Giving a bonus like that as a single action is great, and while it won't last for all too long, it's great for just basic utility. Generally, every single character will make one of those checks before the start of your next turn, and because they can pick and choose which bonus they want it for, you can't mess up by giving them a bonus on a roll that they don't end up making, because they will end up making one of those checks. It's also really useful out of combat, since you can give someone some guidance to help them, say on like an athletics check to climb a wall, or basically anything that involves rolling a dice. Basically, Guidance is just an absolutely killer spell. Haunting Hymn is a fun spell for divine and occult spellcasters that allows for you to deal damage in a 15-foot cone. You deal sonic damage, in that area equal to your spellcasting modifier, though creatures get a basic save to reduce it. If they happen to critically fail on that save, then they are also deafened for 1 minute. Every 2 levels that the spell gets heightened, the damage increases by 1d6. This damage is alright, it's going to be below average for most cantrips, but the area is the best part, since you can generally get a few creatures in a 15-foot cone with some good positioning on your part. Also, sonic damage is one of those damage types that very, very few creatures are immune to, and deafened is a rough condition for spellcasters to have, since it gives them a chance to mess up pretty much all of their spells. Also, I'm just going to point it out that if someone does actually critically fail on their save and become deafened, they are now actually immune to Haunted Hymn, since Haunted Hymn has the auditory trait, meaning it has no effect on someone if they can't hear it. So, yeah, if you deafen someone, don't cast Haunting Hymn on them again, because it'll do nothing. Overall, I really, really love Haunting Hymn, because it has some great effects, some great area, alright damage, but overall, it's just very, very consistent. Have you ever played a druid using the natural medicine feat to heal your allies and thought, why does this druid, who's been living out in the woods for 20 years, have a good set of healer's tools? If so, you're actually in luck, since the healing Plaster spell allows for you to choose some dirt or mud on the ground and turn it into something that is effectively healer's tools, to the horror of anyone who knows about germ theory. In actuality, you don't have to worry about that, since you do purify and sterilize the mud, so it won't be causing any additional infections, but the idea of someone treating my wounds by slapping some dirt on me is a little bit disconcerting. The spell lasts for 10 minutes, and you can use the clay-like substance instead of healer's tools whenever you're using the Administer First Aid or Treat Wounds actions. If you don't use it by the time the 10 minutes are up, or if you cast the spell again, the stuff turns back to its original form. Whenever it is eventually heightened up to 3rd level, you get a +1 item bonus on any medicine checks using it, which saves you some gold of having to buy better healer's tools. Really, that's what this spell is, a way to avoid having to spend some gold on healer's tools. While it might not be a particularly strong spell, because you can just replicate its effects by spending some gold, it is incredibly flavorful, and that's what I look for in my cantrips. If you're looking to be a cheerleader, Infectious Enthusiasm is the best way to do it. You spend 2 actions to cast the spell, and then you either get a +1 status bonus to attack rolls, will saves, or charisma-based skill checks for 1 round. Until the start of your next turn, an ally who saw you casting the spell and was within 30 feet can spend a single action with a concentrate trait to get the same bonus that you got until the start of your next turn. This can be pretty useful in combat situations, but it is generally considered socially unacceptable to cast a spell like this in a social situation, so it negates the bonus on charisma-based checks outside of combat, since using a spell to affect the emotions of people is generally creepy as hell. In a combat situation, though, it is pretty good, since giving your allies a bonus to hit or a bonus on their will saves is great, even if they do have to spend an action to actually benefit from it. Plus, the idea of a wizard saying, "Go team, we've got this," and the fighter spending an action to think, "You know what, I do have this," and actually getting better at attacking is absolutely hilarious. No Direction, outside of being a podcast, is a very situational spell that invalidates one of the uses of the survival skill, namely the No Direction use of a survival skill. Upon casting the spell, you know which way is north. It's that simple. Once you heighten it to level 7, then you know instead the direction to a familiar place, like a home that you've stayed in, or just a place that you spend a lot of time in. In case you are a GM watching this who is scared about this spell ruining exploration sections of your game, it's important to keep in mind that knowing where north is, or knowing which direction it is towards home, doesn't actually help your party navigate the terrain. It's a bit like how in Skyrim you can get a quest marker somewhere, but if you go directly towards the quest marker, you might end up having to go directly over a mountain, which, now that I think about it, you can actually do that in Skyrim, but in Pathfinder it's generally not a very good idea to just go in a straight line, because you're going to run into a lot of obstacles that otherwise you might be able to avoid, or it might just be straight up impossible. Basically, since you can get lost and be bad at navigation when you have a compass which tells you where north is, you can still get lost and be bad at navigation if someone in your party knows no direction. It just helps you out a bunch. It doesn't remove the challenge entirely. But it is nice if you're going to be in a more exploration-focused campaign, because then you don't have to worry about losing your compass or being in a situation where you don't know where north is. It's got to be obvious by this point, but I love what Paizo has done with the cantrips in this system. Cantrips were basically useless in Pathfinder 1e in combat outside of something like Detect Magic, so they took some elements of cantrips from D&D 5e whenever they made 2e, and they made them absolutely their own and different from 5e. Cantrips will be useful throughout your entire time as a spellcaster, and they're just a ton of fun. I especially love how there's a lot of cantrips that are just solutions to problems that people would run into in their day-to-day lives in Golarion. Need to know where north is? Make a spell for it. Need to get a crowd's attention? Make a spell for it. In a world with magic, it'd break immersion for me if spells like that didn't exist, and they're a really fun way to build up a bit of your character by adding flavor to their spell repertoire, rather than just saying, "Oh, I'm a mage that makes spells for day-to-day folks." You literally will know spells that are useful for day-to-day folks. I'm going to be covering the other half of the cantrips in the system next week, so tune in then if that's something that you're interested in. Thanks for watching this video, and if you're watching it on the day that it's released, Happy Thanksgiving! I hope that the holidays are treating you well, and if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, then I still hope that you've had a good day. If you've got any constructive criticism or corrections for this video, then I'd love to hear them down below. I read all of the comments on all of my videos, so if you have any suggestion on something that I might change to make it better, then please let me know, because I will very much take it under consideration. I want to make these videos better every single time I put one out, so every little bit helps. Also, I'd like to hear what cantrips are your favorite, since I love Approximate so much, and I love it despite it having basically no mechanical use. Anyways, if you enjoyed the video, then liking, commenting, and subscribing will help recommend it to other people, and it'll help me a lot in figuring out what people actually want to see from my channel. But regardless, until I see you next, live a wonderful life.